Alliance president, thank you for making the connection and for reading my book and introducing me to Greg, and thanks to all the sponsors. Now transport yourself to another time and place where the boots of tyranny stood on the necks of the twins, liberty and freedom. There is no evidence of tuberculosis in these gypsy twins by evidence, exam, and testing. The radiologist said to Dr. Bengali at the Nazi Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. But the joint pain is a symptom of tuberculosis, said Dr. Bengali. Then he shouted, "All of you are mistaken. Stay here." Bengali left the room. He returned an hour later. "You are right," he said calmly. There was silence in the room. "Yes, I dissected them." He had gone to the twin children, shot them in the neck, and then did an autopsy on them. These are just two of the many murders he committed directly. In addition to selecting the arriving prisoners to go immediately into the gas chambers, you go left, you go right, he injected phenol into prisoners and did horrific pseudoscience experiments on twins, causing the majority to die. He had a fascination with twins. Only a few of the 3,000 twins survived. This evil man, known as the Angel of Death, escaped after World War II and lived in Paraguay and Brazil. Before leaving Auschwitz, he shipped 2 truckloads of records of his work to his mentor, Dr. von Virchow, at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Dr. von Virchow destroyed the records of Mengele's atrocities. Mengele drowned on February 7th, 1799, while swimming, and his remains were identified in a grave on June 6, 1985, under the name Wolfgang Gerhardt. DNA testing confirmed the identity. His family gave up his diaries and letters to investigators. But some of the doctors, as you have seen in the movie, were caught and brought to justice. In the medical case, USA versus Carl Brandt et al., also known as the doctors' trial, 23 doctors and administrators were prosecuted at the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg from December 9, 1946 to August 20th on 4 counts: conspiracy to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, including persons not protected by the laws of war. I should say that was number 1. Number 2 was war crimes, crimes against persons protected by the laws of war, such as prisoners of war. 3, crimes against humanity, and these were the individuals not protected by the laws of war. And membership, number 4, membership in a criminal organization, Nazi SS or Strutstoffen. In the opening statement for the prosecution, Brigadier General Telford Taylor said, "The defendants in this case are charged with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science." He also said, "The charges against these defendants are brought in the name of the United States of America." It is our deep obligation to all peoples of the world to show why and how these things happen. It is incumbent upon us to set forth with conspicuous clarity the ideas and motives which move these defendants to treat their fellow men as less than beasts. The perverse thoughts and distorted concepts which brought about these savageries are not dead. They cannot be killed by force of arms. They must not become a spreading cancer in the heart of humanity. They must be cut out and exposed for the reasons so well stated by Mr. Justice Jackson in the courtroom a year ago. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot tolerate their being repeated. 16 of the defendants were convicted, and 7, including Dr. Karl Brandt, you just saw him in the movie, sentenced to death and executed by hanging on June 2nd, 1948. 9 were given jail sentences ranging from 15 years to life. The remaining 7 were acquitted. Note that Karl Brandt, again, the person you just saw in the video, he was Hitler's first choice to initiate the killing program for, quote, life unworthy of life. He was considered a gifted surgeon and authority on head and neck injuries. As has been pointed out by others, Karl Brandt had been strongly drawn to Albert Schweitzer, a fellow Alsatian, and was said to have been prevented from joining him in medical missionary work in Africa only by French requirements. Schweitzer and Hitler were the 2 most influential figures in Brandt's life. They were his 2 models, his 2 mirrors. The end of that quote. Hard to reconcile this stark contrast in role models unless one hypothesizes an unquenchable need for external recognition by the world, and his goal of recognition justified in his sick mind an end that would use any means to obtain it. Perhaps he felt inadequate and tried to ease his internal fears by control of others in genocide. But I am a surgeon and not a psychiatrist, so I will not enter the minefields of those minds full of evil. Much has been written about the medical killing and the psychology of genocide. One such book is The Nazi Doctors by Robert J. Lifton, MD, where the above quote originated. Dr. Lifton is a psychiatrist. My friend, Dr. Kathy DeAngelis, the current editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, recommended this book to me, and I recommend it to you. Another book that gives a look into the magnitude of the killing is The Death Dealer, the memoirs of the SS commandant at Auschwitz. The commandant, Rudolf Haas, it's H-O-E-S-S in English, my research tells me, quote, describes the order and manner in which the murder of Poles, Russians, Jews, and Gypsies took place in the largest killing center ever created. He estimates the number of Jews killed at Auschwitz to be at least 1.3 million, although initially he said 2.5 million, but commented that all of the records were destroyed and he had no clear idea of the exact number when he wrote the documents in prison that became his autobiography. By the judgment of history and by his own admission, Rudolf Haas is the greatest mass murderer of all time. At the book's introduction, he points out, as the book's introduction points out, he is the only SS officer who wrote at length about the camp from the SS viewpoint. His first chapter is entitled The Final Solution of the Jewish Question in Concentration Camp Auschwitz. Concentration camp Auschwitz, as we all know, was not the only death camp. Stories and books have been written about survivors such as the Polish priest who gave testimony at the doctor's trial about his torture at Dachau concentration camp from 1940 to 1945. He was given malaria without his consent, and various compounds tried on him to see if there was any effect on the malaria. He was also forced to be submerged and endure freezing water experiments. And the prisoners at Buchenwald were shot with poisonous bullets to determine if the poison hastened death over a regular bullet. This was not an experiment looking for an antidote to poison. What I have presented so far is documented beyond any doubt and should suffice to show that these doctors did not act like ethical doctors. They were part of perverted science applied to men, women, and children without consent and without mercy. But my task today is not to recount in detail these horrific events and describe the lies told to the new arrivals, such as the greeting statement that they were to be deloused when they received the order to take off their clothes and go into the showers. Of course, these so-called showers were airtight killing chambers that soon filled with poisonous crystals that produced the poisonous Cyclone B cyanide gas. Drop it, as my expert here just informed me, dropped into an acid and it produces the poisonous gas. An insecticide that was used for roaches that replace shooting the new arrivals. Nor can I give a psychological explanation for such acts by medical professionals who actively participated in the selection and murder of the new arrivals as another of their assigned duties. My goal is to discuss medical ethics and informed consent after the doctor's trial at Nuremberg. Of course, prior to World War II, there existed the Hippocratic Oath, and that alone would forbid all of the assaults, batteries, torture, and murder that took place at the concentration camps under the Nazi regime. The Hippocratic Oath states, among other things, that physicians will keep their patients from harm and injustice. Informed consent was also stressed in the United States in a famous decision in 1914 in Schoellendorf versus Society of New York Hospitals by Justice Benjamin Cardozo, while he served on the highest court in New York, the New York Court of Appeals. He said, every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body. And a surgeon who performs an operation without his patient's consent commits an assault for which he is liable in damages. This is true except in cases of emergency where the patient is unconscious and where it is necessary to operate before consent can be obtained. Justice Cardozo, an eloquent wordsmith, later became a member of the United States Supreme Court. Consider the Hippocratic Oath for a moment, as I did in the speech in 1997, and see if my reflections then hold true today. The oath tells something about the physician taking this vow. Of course, you have to remember, when you speak of the Hippocratic Oath, what oath are you talking about? The original one or subsequent revisions, especially in other countries? And the replacement oaths tell you something about the person taking the oath. Consider the following excerpts from alternative oaths that either pledge allegiance to government or condone euthanasia. These other versions can be found on the internet or on the appendix of Dr. Jane's Orient book, Your Doctor Is Not In. 1. To be guided in all my actions by the principles of communist morality. If it is given to me to save a life, all thanks. But it also may be within my power to take a life. This awesome responsibility must be faced with great humbleness and awareness of my own frailty. And remember that it is wrong to terminate life in certain circumstances, permissible in some, and an act of supreme love in others. Well, I certainly wouldn't want to be treated by a doctor who swore to that oath. Yes, the original Hippocratic Oath has stood the test of time because it gives specific guidelines to the ethical and moral practice of medicine that have been embraced by the majority of physicians as well as the rest of society for over 2,000 years. In 1997, I said that medicine is in crisis and it is appropriate to revisit the Hippocratic Oath, review it, debate it, but do not ignore it. In 1997, the juggernaut of managed care had moved from sea to shining sea. Opportunistic managed care companies proved over and over again that their primary concern is not the patient but the bottom line. They have replaced choice with gag rules and hold harmless clauses. Put that against the Hippocratic Oath, and every time a physician gets the opportunity to join some plan, you have to say, will this interfere with my duty to my patient? Because the duty to the patient and your ethical obligation trumps everything else. I said then, let us not go quietly into the abyss, this new dark age, a dark age of medicine. Let us stand on principle. A revival of the Hippocratic Oath with reasoned discussion of what it means is a step away from the abyss. And with the current debate in Congress, as you heard mentioned, there's a little activity going on. We need to compare fanciful offerings to reform the health delivery system against the Hippocratic Oath and ethics. Remember the patient. That's my plea. Let's always focus on the patient. Fix the problem, but don't create a system that removes the patient from control of his or her health care and destroys the patient-physician relationship. Now, before we get to these other codes that evolved after Nuremberg, when people speak of ethics, my first question is, that's a good topic to discuss, but please explain to me your definition of ethics. In other words, what is your reasoning model? Because I submit that depending on your model, you can get a different answer. Very important to understand the model. For instance, one model is called the Deontological Model. Rightness is not defined in terms of their consequences. What it means is violate no rights. So let me give you an example. A patient is admitted, and the patient has dead tissue in the foot, gangrene of the foot. It is too late to do a bypass. The tissue is already dead. And the offending part of the patient needs to be amputated to save the patient's life. In a deontological model, the patient is conscious, the patient is able to make decisions, and the patient is asked, will you give me permission? You have gangrene of the foot, germs will get in your bloodstream, and you will die. This will spread up your leg. We need to amputate your leg. In a deontological model, the patient says yes or no, but the patient makes the decision. The patient is primary. And so the doctor doesn't operate. The patient may say, I have a religious belief that if I die, and all of my parts go with me to my grave. That's the patient's belief, and we honor that in the deontological model. In a teleological model, an alternative way, it's goal or consequence oriented. And in the example I gave you, the doctor would say, I have superior knowledge. The patient doesn't understand germs and sepsis and the possibility, the high probability of death. So what I will do is I will supersede what the patient wants because I am doing a greater good. I'm saving the patient's life. Give the patient medication, get the anesthesia, we're going to the operating room, and the leg is amputated, or the foot is amputated. That's the teleological. The social utility model is the greatest good for the greatest number. And of course, when you get the word good, that's a fascinating word because you meet a bunch of people and there'll be a bunch of definitions of good. Good might mean that I take from you whatever I need because I want it. That would be some people's definition of good. So you got to understand what good means, and that's essential in the discussion. So I really get frustrated when I see sweeping laws about to be done in our Congress, and I have great love for America, and I have great love for our fighting force, and I wear this pin in honor of the people who died protecting our liberties. But at the same time, I expect people who represent us, senators and representatives, I expect them to know what they're talking about, and when they don't, they bring in experts to explain what this means before they pass things that they haven't even read. I find that personally offensive, and I tell them that whenever I get the opportunity, and lately I've been getting a lot of opportunities to express that view. So, once you select one of those models, it's not over with. You got subsets, you got autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. And then just to take justice alone, you have to look at the egalitarian, the communitarian, the libertarian, and the utilitarian model. So this is a very complicated issue. So when somebody says it's unethical, you just say, stop, tell me your definition, how'd you determine, what's the model, how'd you come to that conclusion, and so on. So what we want to do is, I go back to the Hippocratic Oath, it doesn't give this generality, it gives you specifics. You will do no harm to the patient. You will protect the patient. Very specific things in there. You will not poison the patient. So, let's go back to Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Code was born with the doctor's trial. Now remember, as a result of the doctor's trial, this code came out and said, this is what, when you come to court, we're going to look at this code because we're going to hold you accountable under this code. And as a result of that and these horrible atrocities that were done by the Nazis, people began to look at codes and come up with other codes. Now, let me just tell you a couple of things from the Nuremberg Code, because all of these codes, if I read this, it's very important information. But on the other hand, you know how it is when somebody starts reading all the different codes and every little subsets, everybody starts thinking, wow, this is important, but I do have other things to do, so I'm not going to do that. But all of this is available. You can go to Health and Human Services website on the internet, and every one of these codes I'm talking about, including the Nuremberg Code, we're going to talk about the Belmont Code. We're going to talk about the World Medical Association, Declaration of Helsinki. Every one of those is published there. Of course, you can get them at other websites, too. You can get much of this at the Jackson Senate website. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Now, when you say the subject, suddenly you realize that what we're talking about here is not just ethics in general and not consent in general. You suddenly get the realization that we're talking about experiments. So the claim by the Nazis that they were doing scientific experiments, of course, is a false claim. But what the court did is said, let's talk about experiments. If you're going to do something to a human being, you got to have the person's permission, number one. It has to be absolutely voluntary. The experiment should be expected to yield fruitful results for the good of society. I don't think taking a bullet and putting poison on the bullet and shooting one person with a poison bullet and the other person with a regular bullet to see which one dies faster, I don't think that's a benefit to anyone except killers. And that's of no value to society. No experiment, number 5, no experiment should be conducted except when there's a priori reason to believe that death, where there is a reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur. Except in some situation, if you, the doctor, you're going to serve as the experimental subject. And some doctors in history did do that. The man who discovered the germ causing ulcers, when people wouldn't believe him, he took the germs and he said, I'm going to drink the germs, and he did. And then he said, now gastroscope me and look and you'll see I have the ulcers, and he did. He ended up getting the Nobel Prize. So if you're going to do something that's risky, you do it on yourself. And people have done that throughout history. But don't do that on other people. It's kind of like the man in a war who says, okay, the enemy is over there with a machine gun. Now this is what we're going to do. You run up there and we're going to wish you well. We'll move back 2 blocks. No, the great leaders, the point that I make in my book on leadership, the great leaders, George Washington, my gold standard, George Washington, he said, what do you think? What do you think? Okay, we'll come to an agreement what we should do. Crossing the Delaware after losing battle after battle to the British, he said, we know the enemy's on the other side. We got to cross. It's Christmas Day. It's freezing. This is a treacherous river to cross under these circumstances. But he asked for advice. And then, as the picture shows, he led the troops. And that's what he did throughout battles. He was at the front of the battle. That's why his men loved him. That's why they revered him, because he never asked them to do something that he wasn't willing to do. My dad, another example in the book, when there was a man who took hostages and he had the gun at the hostage's head, he didn't say, okay, Lieutenant, you go in there and take that gun away. He walked out of the police car in full view of the man with the gun, and he took his coat off and laid it on the ground, slowly reached for that standard issue 38 4-inch Smith & Wesson 6-shot revolver, held it up, laid it on the ground, and calmly walked into the house and took the gun away from the man. And he made a promise to the man. He said, you're sick, you have a fever, and I can help you. I will take you to the doctors at Charity Hospital. And he talked the man out of the gun and took the gun away. And when the other police ran in thinking that he was going to be shot, the policeman would be shot, my dad would be shot, they said, we'll take him to lockup, Major. And he said, no, I promised the man I would take him to Charity Hospital. And that's why the crooks that he caught respected him. That's why the men who followed him respected him. And so when a doctor says, we're going to try you essentially as a guinea pig or for bad purposes, that should never be allowed without the patient's full consent. You should never volunteer, of course, for anything that's going to result in using something for bad. So out of this, the Nuremberg Code became the springboard for other codes. As Dr. Todd Rice of Vanderbilt University School of Medicine wrote, the principles in conducting human research were first developed as the Nuremberg Code to try Nazi war criminals. The 3 basic elements of the Nuremberg Code, voluntary informed consent, favorable risk-benefit analysis, and right to withdraw without repercussions. So during the study, you have the right to say, I've had enough of this, I quit, and no one can coerce you or force you to stay in the study. This became the foundation for subsequent ethical codes and research regulations. In 1964, the World Medical Association. This is not the World Health Organization, this is the World Medical Association. This is the voluntary group. The American Medical Association is there, the German Medical Association, the Swedish Medical Association, the French Medical Association. All of these groups voluntarily get together twice a year. They have discussions on ethics and other issues very important in the practice of medicine across boundaries of countries. And I had the privilege to be there for several years as a member of the AMA delegation when I finished my tour of duty, and I was on the ethics committee when I was chair of the AMA delegation of the World Medical Association. And I was impressed how serious all of these representatives were to protect patients, to never let happen what happened in Nazi Germany. And there was no one there advocating that patients be treated the way, in any way that would violate their rights. So I was very pleased to see that. Now, keep in mind, and what I'm going to give you as part of my conclusion to all of this, keep in mind that you can have all the regulations in the world. You can have all the things posted on the wall. You must do this to help patients and so on. And when someone comes and says, if you want to be advanced here in government or in the party, you will do this. Or if you don't do this, we will see that harm comes to your family. That's when leadership comes up. And during Nazi Germany, there were a group of students, many of them medical students, and they protested what Hitler, when they heard of the things that were happening, they made this big protest, and they said this man must be removed. And of course what happened was they went and captured all of those students and they cut their heads off. Now, that is what happens when tyranny takes over. And so we have to make sure that we never let evil people get into control in government. In other words, you just can't say, oh, I'm too tired, I can't get involved in that, none of my business. Go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and you'll see the man who said, oh, I didn't say anything when they took the Jewish man away because of none of my business, you know. Oh, I didn't say anything when they took that other man away. And finally, one day, when they took the priest away, I didn't say anything. And he said, finally, they came for him, and there was no one to protest because all the neighbors had been taken away. And so that's what it means to have courage and to speak up before such atrocities have the opportunity to happen. Now, the World Medical, I'm just going to say a couple of them, in Helsinki, that's where it was. These things are usually named where the hall is or the country that it occurs in. It was in Helsinki. And there have been additions and revisions. Another one, 64 was the original, then 75, then 83, then 89, and in 2004 I had the privilege to be there during that debate for that revision. It is the duty of the physician to promote and safeguard the health of the people. In medical research on human subjects, considerations related to the human subject should take precedence over the interests of science and society. Medical research is subject to ethical standards that promote respect for all humans and protect their health and rights. Now, I'm not going to read them all, but I want to read this one because I think this one is absolutely important. They're all important, but this one needs to be in bold letters and remind people. No national, this is number 9, no national ethical, legal, or regulatory requirement should be allowed to reduce or eliminate any of the protections for human subjects set forth in this declaration. Now, you have to decide if you agree with the declaration, but on the other hand, the message I get out of that, just because something comes from the national government that says people of a certain age will no longer be given medical care, and it is best that they realize their time is up and we will end their life. If such an edict ever came, you could not tolerate that. That would be horrible. And so you say, well, you heard what they said. I was just doing my duty. And if you read it's not my fault. I was just doing my duty. Well, if an evil person tells you to kill someone else, you have to say, no, that is not my duty. I do not accept that as a valid duty because I am an ethical person. I'm going to skip by the rest of this. Obviously, you have to be a volunteer in a medical experiment. You can't be coerced or intimidated. And then the federal government, 1974, they did the National Research Act. The Belmont Report came out. And the Belmont is a conference center at the Smithsonian, so it's called the Belmont Report. And this represents ethical principles and guidelines for research involving human subjects. Remember, the Nuremberg Code, the criteria to judge physicians and scientists who had conducted biomedical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. This is, in a free world, rules, regulations, guidelines for ethical experimentation. And it goes through all of these. Basically, what it says in one part, the principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Now, let's go to informed consent. You heard what Justice Cardozo said, informed consent. You got to get permission. Now, if I go up to you and say, look, I want to operate on you, and I don't tell you about all the other things that could happen to you as a result of this operation, oh, that sounds like fun. I think I'll have the operation. Well, that's a consent, so there's no battery there, no assault. I define assault as the threat of harm, and battery as an actual harmful touching. But it's not an informed consent. An informed consent is when you tell what you're planning to do, the nature and purpose of the operation, the risk involved, especially the material risks such as death, brain damage, paralysis, quadriplegia, loss of organ, loss of function of organ, disfiguring scar. Those are important things. You should know about that. And there's specific risks for the organ that's going to be operated on. That should be told. And then you get into other issues like who determines if in America, informed consent, this definition holds true in all 50 states. A consent obtained after adequate disclosure. Sounds simple enough, but what's adequate disclosure? That's like saying after good, after, do good. Well, tell me what your definition of good is. Adequate disclosure is the battleground. And so in some states you have an objective standard whereby what they call the objective physician standard, it's physicians decide what risk should be told. In other states they call it the subjective determination of the standard, and so it's what a reasonable patient would want to know under the circumstances. So that almost always goes to the jury, because the jury are the, quote, reasonable people, and they will determine if it was reasonable what was told. Oh, they forgot to mention that, and we consider that it would have been reasonable to have mentioned that because the patient would have known, would have refused the operation. Then you have the causation. Even knowing that, would you have refused the operation? So, informed consent in Louisiana, we had a problem with informed consent in this sense, that a lot of suits not only implied negligence, but also implied that there was a lack of informed consent. And so the legislature got together in '75. I had the privilege to testify on this for the Medical Society, and they came up with an informed consent law. And they said, if you do it this way, you can do it any way you want. Take your chances. But if you do it this way, and you tell everybody the nature and purpose of the operation, just what I told you a moment ago, the risk involved, including the risk, and they listed the risk, which is unusual, in the statutory definition: death, brain damage, quadriplegia, paraplegia, loss of organ, loss of function of organ, disfiguring scar. If you tell people that, you've given them a high level of warning, and it's their responsibility to ask you additional questions. And multiple appellate courts upheld that. And then suddenly in 1979, famous Hondrulas case came up, and a justice on the Supreme Court of Louisiana wrote for the majority that no, you had to give the material risk. That's okay, but you had to tell them. There was a nurse who got operated on and had bladder dysfunction. She had back surgery and bladder dysfunction, so you needed to mention that particular thing. So everybody said, well, what are we going to do? We got all the lawyers together, the consultants in the room. We had about 50 of them. They came to a big conference, and there were about 33 definitions of what you need to do. So we went back to the legislature, and they said, okay, what we're going to do is give you an alternative, and that way we'll have the medical disclosure panel. I had the privilege to serve as chair of that for 10 years. We had 3 plaintiff attorneys, we had a defense attorney, we had 1 oral surgeon, we had 6 medical doctors, and we would ask experts around the country what risks were material for, say, an abdominal hysterectomy. We would get 15 things. We would then put it out for the world to see, public comment, like an administrative procedure, and then we'd have open hearings where we didn't say anything, we just listen, took all in, and meet again, and so on. And that has worked well for Louisiana. You don't have to do that. You can do it the old way and take your chances under the Hondrulas decision. So informed consent is very important. And of course, if there was informed consent in these camps, these innocent people brought into these camps against their will, obviously there would have been no atrocities. So one cannot say that these were scientific experiments. That's just nonsense. That's a lie. These were calculated evil approaches. And what I said in 1985, that we are always engaged in a battle of philosophical principles. And if you grant an erroneous premise, all the meetings and attention to detail will not make that conclusion correct. This is my outgoing speech as president of Louisiana State Medical Society. When one concludes that enslavement is wrong, it serves no worthwhile purpose to go to meetings that will decide who will be the guards. Challenge the assumptions. Remember that those who lust to control your destiny draw their power from your sanction. So evil people cannot remain in office without the sanction of the people. They remain there with the power of guns and force. But when the people rise up, those people are removed. So we must not let intimidation or panic control our destiny. We must let reason reign. Remember that one person in the right tips the scales of justice more than the majority in the wrong. In the quest for right, go for truth and not the votes or market share. Don't be like those people. I write about it in my book. My wife said, you brought everything to the meeting, and I left it in the room. But anyway, I had it marked on the page. But I love Dante's immortal poem, In the Vestibule of Hell. I think those are some of the most interesting characters. These are the opportunists. And they're constantly chasing a waving banner, and their punishment, they don't even get the credit of going to hell. They're not even good enough to get into hell. And they're constantly punished through all eternity by stinging hornets because they're opportunists. These are essentially the people that all they got to do is do what the poll says to do at the moment, regardless of whether the poll was valid or not. In other words, they have no internal principles. They're true opportunists, and we have to be careful. So I ended that with my modification of Kipling. If you can risk it all by standing up for truth and the patient's best interest, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And which is more, you will be a doctor in the true sense of the word, my son. So we must be, as Henley said, the master of our fate, the captain of our soul. The last thing I'll tell you, and then I'm going to open up for questions, the last thing I wanted to mention is that I have the privilege to teach medical students at Tulane. I teach a course on medical leadership. And it's great teaching students because I always appreciate it. I see one of my colleagues in the audience from Tulane days. I always appreciated professors who gave me something that I would remember and would help me in the middle of the night when I'm dealing with a patient who's dying and I'm doing my very best to save the patient's life. And so I've had the privilege to give some medical school commencement speeches, and you know, nobody wants to hear what you have to say on the day you graduate from med school. I mean, they want to party, okay? I mean, I can see them out there, they're buzzing. How long is this guy Palmisano going to take? We're out of here. And so I just stand up there, I do that dramatic pause, I don't say anything, and then they say, oh my God, he's forgotten what he's going to say. Are they going to hook him off the stage, you know? So that gets their attention. And then I say, sexy. And then the people in back of me, all the people in the gowns, they said, my God, what is this guy doing? Sexy. I said, it's not S-E-X-Y, it's S-E-C-C, science, ethics, compassion, courage. Those are the first 4 commandments, in my belief. And add 2 more. Science, ethics, compassion, and courage, and add to it, always do what's in the patient's best interest, and do it with the patient's informed consent. And that will be your North Star at midnight when you're at a patient's bedside and it looks like the patient is going to die and you're doing your very best, you've had consultants, and you will run through your mind, or have you taken care of all 6 of these? Is there something else you should be doing? And if there's nothing else that can be done, then you'll do your best to make sure the patient has comfort and that you will be considered what you're meant to be, a true healer for the benefit of your patients. So I'm going to stop now. I thank you for the opportunity. My summary is the Nuremberg trials, the doctor's trial, was a very important thing. It not only put before the world criminals who had abused the trust as physicians, There were true criminals who did horrible, horrible things. But it came forth with a code and said, we will hold you responsible if this is ever seen again and if you act in this manner. And as a result of that, we have seen other principles, codes, and regulations I've mentioned. I didn't even mention the American Medical Association Code of Principles. But all of those things are evolving constantly, and we must keep that in the forefront. And the bottom line, as always, is it doesn't do any good to have a rule book or a code book if you don't follow it. And it's our responsibility to constantly follow it. Thank you very much. Yes?
I've heard that people still use the research from Nazi experiments and are validating that as valuable research, and always, of course, the ethics of that issue. Is that not true, that the printed results of experimentation are still being used by some people, and they justify it as valid research?
Well, I'm not aware of that. I've heard that discussion before. I've not personally read any evidence that that is taking place. What I have read is that there was nothing really that was gained by what they did. They violated, not only did they violate the rights of people and did these criminal things, but they didn't do proper experimental protocol. I mean, when you think of the proper way to do an experiment, even under ethical conditions, I write about a young doctor in my book. Pronovost is his name. I admire him. He did an experiment at Johns Hopkins. He's still there. He did an experiment of patients in the intensive care unit who were getting sepsis. They were dying. And he was trying to prevent that from happening. And so he came up with a new technique. And to his great joy, he reduced the death rate 69%, comparing it to previous studies. And he published that. It went all over the world, a celebrated breakthrough. But being an honest man, and that's why I heard him say this I'm on the board of the National Patient Safety Foundation, and they have an annual Congress, and I went to it, and I was in the audience, and he was speaking. What I admired about him was he continued to look at his statistics, and he found that he made a sampling error. And as a result of that sampling error, he realized that he did not improve it at all. His results were the same. So he wanted to tell the world. He was kind of like the ancient mariner walking around. He wanted to tell the world. And I wrote about him. I said, we need more honest scientists like Dr. Pronovost. So I'm not aware of it. There may be people much more knowledgeable than I am. I want to thank the director of the AMA, James S. Todd Memorial Library, Sandra Sheffers, who pulled all sorts of peer-reviewed articles for me on short notice some months ago. But I'm not aware of it. But I will put that as an inquiry to look and see if anybody's trying to say that. What I did read is that any results obtained as a result of torture through these horrible means should never be used, should never be allowed to be published, and not used. All that does is incentivize people who are looking for fame and glory, perhaps, or whatever. But it just should never be used. It's tainted. It's kind of like what the attorneys do. You know, it's the fruit of the poisonous tree. You just can't use it. That would be my thought on it. Yes, sir.
Was torture ever mentioned? Did that ever come out of the Nuremberg Code? Torture itself?
You know, we have the scholars who know much more about the trial. Was torture itself ever mentioned? I mean, there was torture, obviously, that went, but in the Nuremberg Code, I mean, what they say in the Nuremberg Code, I mean, torture is not allowed in any type. If you claim you're doing experiments, you can't torture anybody, because the moment you do harm, yes, sir. You want to comment? Did you raise your hand to comment? No? Okay, I'm sorry. So would anybody like to address that? No? I mean, obviously, the Nuremberg Code is saying if you're doing an experiment, allegedly for medical science, you know, you're not going to be able to do torture, because you have to do this voluntarily with the patient's consent, and the patient can withdraw at any time, and so on. And all the codes since then have said that. Yes, ma'am.
A comment and a question.
Yes.
One of the comments as far as Bengali, the angel of death, he replicated the same experiments on South American Indians as he had done in Auschwitz. So when he escaped Europe, he just continued his practices. The question is, though, in a comment from you, I would presume that the United States is a 1970s. Any observation or comment as far as that particular time?
Well, the experiment that she's talking about, the Tuskegee Experiments, that's another example of an abuse of individuals. This was a syphilis experiment. It was mainly poor African Americans who were in this, and they followed the natural course of syphilis. And meanwhile, penicillin comes out, and penicillin, of course, as you well know, is very effective in killing the syphilis spirochete. But they did not give them the penicillin. They just wanted to continue to observe, and that has been, just denounced and so on. So even though the United States came out with the United States did the trial. Taylor was the prosecutor. It was the United States versus Bront et al. And so that should never have been done. And as a result of that, that's when Congress passed the law, and they came out with the Belmont and so on and all the regulations. So yes, and again, that's you make my point that I made in my plea, is that it doesn't matter how many rules you got to follow the rules. And when people don't follow the rules, you got to have the courage to speak up. And why don't people speak up? I have a chapter, I deal with that. I mean, leadership mandates that you will speak up. And some people are afraid to speak up for any number of reasons. But if you want to be a leader, if you want to be a person, by my definition of good, an ethical person that tries to help others, then you have to speak up. Now, they'll take away my money. They'll kill me. They'll hurt my children. Well, you have to get other people involved, and you have to speak up. If you don't, then you end up with the Hitlers running the country. Yes, sir.
Doctor, from generalized reports of waterboarding, it was very, very frequently a doctor who was in attendance, supposedly, to make sure that there was not organ failure, whatever the spurious commentary was. What's that doctor's duty, and did he violate any one of the codes?
Well, it's before I answer that, let me just back up. It's like if a murderer is caught and found guilty by the jury, and in that state there is the death penalty, and that person is to be executed. And of course there are different ways to execute people, as you well know: electric chair, hanging, and so on. But there's also lethal injection. Well, it's unethical, according to the American Medical Association interpretation of the AMA ethical principle. It's unethical for a physician to be involved in injecting the poison. And I've been on some radio shows that discuss that. And the reason is, you as a physician are there to comfort people and save lives, to heal people as best you know how with available facilities. You're not there to kill people. And so a physician is not ethically allowed to do that. Now, in the example that you give, if someone is waterboarded and they have a physician standing by, what is the purpose of the physician? To determine that they're not going too far or whatever? I mean, I would find that very difficult to participate in that. And I would suspect that that's going to be an issue that is going to come up. There are people writing about this. There are people writing peer-review articles about that. In other words, that would be a question for the different groups. The CJA, the Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs of the American Medical Association, they have that question put there and not accept a vague answer, a very specific answer about that. And so what these codes deal with as a result of the Nuremberg trials, these codes deal with experiments. Waterboarding is not an experiment. Waterboarding is whatever you want to call it, whether you call it enhanced interrogation, torture, whatever. People, that's not, so that doesn't fit into these. It goes back to the general principles of the ethical duties of a physician. So I don't know that I can answer it any better than that, but I would say that you as a physician, in other words, supposing they do something else in your presence, what are you going to do? You see? I mean, why would you even participate in something like that? That would be my thought. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, in light of that and your code, I'd like to know your comment on what's going on with the pharmaceutical industry get it out, we'll make our money up front, and then later we'll pay the fine when the problems show up.
Well, obviously, that would not be a correct thing to do. What? Oh, repeat the question. I'm sorry. I am hard of hearing, and my wife says, be prepared, so I didn't get the new, I tried to, the batteries were dead in my little hearing aid. It went beep, beep, and then it was about to go dead, so I apologize for that. Yes, okay, so I'm hard of hearing. I'm having trouble hearing here, so I know you may have trouble with normal hearing back there, so I apologize for that. Basically, is that a drug company is coming out with a new drug, and there are reports that this can cause harm to people, and it is stated by some that you've heard these reports that they're just going to allegedly, just go ahead and put it out, make the money, and then we'll just pay the fines later on. Well, that would be wrong. Obviously, that's wrong, and that ought to be stopped. And that's the role of an FDA that functions well, is to test that. In other words, you remember the story of thalidomide that was used for morning sickness and pregnancy in Europe, and they stopped it before it came into this country. So apparently people who got it not through the regular channels, and as a result, it would stop the growth of the arms, the legs, and so on. Babies were born without arms or legs. And so that's why there needs to be that testing. I mean, I remember as an intern, one of the other medical doctors at Charity Hospital walked up, have you heard the latest drug? And it's great. It lowers cholesterol. They finally found the drug that lowers cholesterol. Imagine what the future holds. And I said, well, that's good. Give me the name of it. So I wrote it down. I think it was MER29. I said, well, I'm going to make a note of that and study that drug a little bit. That'll be good, because I knew I was going to be a surgeon, but I wanted to take 6 months of medicine. So I took what they call a mixed medical internship to really, I felt, I'm going to be a surgeon that really understands medicine, fluid, and electrolyte. And so I went to look at it, and then I found that people who was taking the drug were going blonde. I said, well, that's not a good idea. I mean, you have some potential problem with the cholesterol, but I mean, I think I'd rather have that potential problem than be blonde. And so they suddenly pulled that off the market. And so that, the thalidomide episode, say we need to make sure that we do this properly and test it. Now, there will always be some things. Let me move away from something that's not harmful to us in our personal life. It may be actually in your business, but it's software. You hear the story that one company has this software, the operating system, and it's a super duper software. And the other company, they're almost ready for prime time, and they want to be there for the holiday season, and it's not quite finished. So what they do is, instead of just having their beta 1, beta 2 testers, they just dump it on all of us, and we buy it. And then I have this little computer, and it just died the other day, and it was sad. They couldn't resuscitate it. But anyway, I got a new computer. It is nice. It's fast, and everything. But the old one, they said, oh, you need to upgrade your software. You need to upgrade. I said, well, my old software works pretty well. Well, you can upgrade it and you can back up. It just backs up automatic. Okay. Well, guess what? It had all those things on there, but it didn't back up anymore on my hard drive. It didn't recognize them. And it says, we don't know what that is. A foreign object. We're not going to allow you to back up to it. So that took weeks to figure that out. So that analogy goes that we become testers, and the problem is lots of frustration, and maybe you lose some data. But when you're talking about your life, you don't want to take something where suddenly you have a stroke or you're blind or whatever. So it needs to be tested. But even when they do it the right way, there will be some subsets of people, because of whatever, maybe genetically or whatever, and it will have a different effect on them. So in other words, you can't test it on the whole world in the beginning, because if harm comes, the whole world gets the harm. So you do it with volunteers. But the volunteers, it has to be people who are true volunteers. Yes, ma'am.
I read in the paper about the fact there are not a lot of breakthroughs in cancer treatment because people don't want to be a kind of experimental thing. What's the ethical problem? In other words, can doctors ethically perform these trials knowing that part of the population isn't getting any
What I hear you saying, I'm going to ask you for the last little bit again, but what I hear you saying is that there are some potentially good drugs, but they don't have a population to test it on. People don't want to volunteer for it. Now tell me the next part. I'm sorry.
Is there an ethical dilemma for doctors
Okay, so what is the ethical dilemma for the doctors who would be able to give drugs, but one half of the population, for whatever reason, elects not to participate?
In a trial, you're not, you know.
Right. Well, again, you try to encourage, in other words, you have to decide what is a necessary sample to have valid statistics, and then you try to have people do it on a voluntary basis. And you give them the reasons for it, and you assess what the probabilities are. In other words, before you do humans, almost always you do animals first. So if all the dogs or rats or hamsters or whatever, if they all die, well then not a good idea to move to human testing. But if all of those creatures make it, and then you say, well, what groups, in other words, who's got the problem, first of all? In other words, no use testing it on babies if they don't have the problem of memory loss, right? So you need to find a subset of people that need it. And then when you do that, you have to make sure that it's all voluntary. Let me, yeah, the placebo, that my wife is in the back. My wife's an attorney. She's reminding me of things that I would forget. But the placebo, it is, when you look at the World Medical Association, their declaration, Helsinki, it talks about placebo, and you look at what's at HHS, Health and Human Services, they talk about the use of placebos and when it's acceptable and when not and so on. But the other thing that leads into, I don't know if I fully answered your question, but one thing it does leads into, and I thank you for asking that because it made me remember this and I wanted to tell you this, is that one of the things we looked at the World Medical Association, let's say we go to Africa and we have this subset of folks out there who have this condition, and that's what we want to try to find something for, a cure. And so when we develop this drug, the drug company, they do the testing and so on, and let's say they find a cure. You've tested it on all these people, and they don't have the opportunity to get that drug. So the people you developed it for, they're shut off from access to the drug. So we put in there that you have to have a mechanism where they can have access to the drug too. In other words, if they're going to be volunteers, I mean, why are they volunteering? I mean, do they fully understand why they are volunteering? Are they getting money for the trial? Whatever it is. But at least they should be able to get cured of the condition too. They should have access to it. And I think the more we bring all that out, we can help disseminate that. Yes, sir. Well, they have people in this audience who are much more expert at answering those questions, and perhaps they'll address it in their question. But you know, the government, we have you have prosecutors, federal prosecutors, you have investigation units, you have things. The people in this audience that are true experts. I'm certainly not an expert in that. But if something is brought to light by a newspaper article or whatever, there's a congressional hearing on it, and the next thing you know, there's a special prosecutor to look in it. So we have mechanisms. It's just a question of when is the appropriate time to activate those mechanisms. Yes, sir.
The average medical student graduates with over 100,000 education credits, some more. And that almost insists that they have to get a paycheck first day out of office. So the drum joint group or a non-physician is going to write their paycheck. What does that imply for ethical decision making?
Well, the question is, medical students come out of med school with debts of greater than $100,000. It's in some places $150,000 or more. I had one the other day who said his greatly exceeded $150,000. And so they need to make money. You know, you have, depending on who has the loan and how much time they give you to pay it back. But I meet very few medical students that would do what we did. You know, oh, you got gray hair, you're one of those old guys. You know, it's not like that anymore. You know, when we come out, we want to work certain hours. We're going to go work for a group. This malpractice system we got is so broken. People can file suits without merit. 80% of closed with no payment. When the doctor goes to trial, he wins. She or he wins 89%. Why do I want to worry about that? I'm going to go work for this clinic. They're going to give me a salary. They have somebody else on this coding. I don't understand it. It's a bunch of nonsense. And so I'm going to let these other professional coders do it. You just tell me, when do I get my check? I will do quality medicine. If you got any special rules here, and so on. That does not, even though people take that choice, some do, and they believe they're forced to do that, that does not eliminate your ethical responsibility to the patient. And if they come out with some rule at that clinic that you will do this, thus, and so, and it's against your ethical, which you know it's wrong, then you shouldn't do it. You should stand up. And you have to do that, and you take the consequences. And sometimes people do things, and they're just ignorant of what the right thing. When I was a young doctor, I was rotating to another hospital, and as a young resident, they say, go up to room such and such. They need you up there. A doctor's operating. A lady with a perforated ulcer. So I go up there and I scrubbed up and I went in and introduced myself. It was a very elderly doctor. He was a family medicine doctor. And the woman had a perforated ulcer. Straight, the ulcer had broken anteriorly on the stomach and all the fluid was coming out. And she was rapid pulse rate. And she was very dehydrated. It was obvious to me as a resident. I just read Metabolic Care, the Surgical Patient by the famous Harvard surgeon, a gigantic blue book. And I knew a lot about